Hey, I'm Will Parker Anderson, the host of the Writer Circle podcast, which you're about to watch. It's a huge help to us if you would just like this video and subscribe to our channel because we want you to be a part of our writing community. Enjoy the show.
All right, let's jump in here. Well, Ally, I've been so eager to talk with you because you sit in so many unique roles. You're a best-selling author, you're a collaborative writer who helps others tell their stories, and you're a writing coach. And so some people are incredible writers, but they can't explain why they're good. You, on the other hand, bring both literary skill and the heart of a teacher who can help the rest of us grow in our craft. So thank you for joining the Writer Circle today. Really excited to have you.
Thank you. That's a very generous description. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay, so your new book is called Write Your Story, a simple framework to understand yourself, your story, and your purpose in the world. And I have to imagine sort of a manifesto like this is the culmination of many years of writing and experience. So can you kind of give us a snapshot of where this book came from and how it can help writers?
Yeah, I can tell you work in publishing because that's a very astute way to describe. Yeah, it is a manifesto, and it has been. It's the culmination of the last 15 years of my career, which started because I always knew deep in my guts that I wanted to write a book. That's where it all really started. I can remember being as young as like 10 or 12 years old and being like, someday I'm going to write a book. And you know, I loved at the time, I was reading C.S. Lewis. I was reading like some authors like C.S. Lewis who were like, you know, just like such legacy writers and go down in history and are appealing to pretty much everyone. And then I also remember reading like, you know, The Babysitter's Club and Robin Jones Gunn and you know, some sort of like teenage series and dramas and that sort of thing too.
Yeah.
And either way, I was like, I'm going to write a book like this one day. I know I am. So when I got out of college and grad school and started working full time, I was realizing that I'm going to have to quit my full-time job if I'm ever going to find the space in my life to really do that. So I quit my job and gave myself a buffer of about 6 months to write a book. That's how long I thought it would take me to write my first manuscript. And then like 3 years later, I published my first book.
Wow.
So when I published Packing Light in 2013, it was a huge accomplishment, and it was like the culmination of a long journey that I had been on, and really exciting in that way. And it also did very well in the marketplace, so exciting on that front also. But I also realized that I was going to have to find another way to support myself financially, because selling books, unless I was selling hundreds of thousands of books, wasn't going to be, you know, earning me a full-time income. So that's when I started coaching writers. I started working with other people who were on a similar journey to me, who knew that they wanted to write a book, but couldn't quite figure out how to crack the code. So I had like the unique angle of my own personal experience, having walked that journey, and plus my graduate work was in education. So I could build a curriculum for someone and really teach them how to do something like that. So so I transitioned into coaching writers during that time, and I just started to notice that people were having this really profound transformative experience with the act of writing their books. And that is what really stuck out to me. I was like, I knew that was true for me, that when I'd written Packing Light, and it was a really transformative experience for me. It was about more than just publishing the book. It was also like taught me to see my life in a different kind of way. But then I'm watching other people have that same experience, and I was like, oh, this must be universal. This must be like a universal thing, that when we sit down to write our stories, we understand ourselves better, we become more confident, we have more clarity about what our lives are really about. And that's really where Write Your Story was born, was both my own personal experience writing personal stories, and then also working with clients and watching them have a similar kind of transformation.
Wow. That makes so much sense that you have a background in education as well, because you can, you know, looking through this book, you can just see that teacher's awareness and skill coming through. I want to kind of hone in on something you said in your story, which was you quit your job, first of all, which is sort of the, you know, every writer's rock star dream is just to quit it all and do the thing. But you said you gave yourself 6 months to write, and somewhere I've heard you use that time frame of 6 months. And it seems like it's become sort of a template for you. And a lot of writers intend to get to their project, right? They're waiting for the right season, and the next thing they know, decades go by. So can you just speak to sort of the importance of self-imposed urgency when it comes to, hey, if you have an idea stirring in you, acting upon it? I don't know if you would describe it that way, but just give us some wisdom on kind of deadlines, timelines, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, I teach writers to give themselves a self-imposed deadline. And I teach an online course called A Book in 6 Months, where I teach people how to complete a manuscript in 6 months. Because I think, in my opinion, 6 months is about the perfect amount of time if you're really committed to a book project, that you can finish the first draft of a manuscript. I see a lot of stuff on Instagram where people are like, write a manuscript in 2 weeks or whatever. And
30 days.
Yeah, it just drives me crazy, because I'm like, you can't in good faith you can't write anything worth publishing or reading in 30 days. I mean, you could definitely make some good progress, but I think it takes about 6 months to write the first draft of a manuscript. So I teach people to give themselves a self-imposed deadline, just like I did. Now, I will say I was pretty naive when I did this, because I was focused on writing the manuscript. I wasn't really thinking about the publishing logistics. So I didn't know, I had no idea that you couldn't just submit a manuscript to a publisher. I didn't know what a book proposal document was. I didn't know any of that. So it's very naive. And the other thing that I tell people is, I kept telling myself that I was too busy to write a book, that I needed more time. And so that was why I quit my job. Now, when I talk to writers about finding time to write their book, I don't tell them to quit their jobs. In fact, I think it's really impractical and irresponsible to take away your financial stability while writing a book, because your financial security is what gives you the solid ground to go be the safety from which to go be creative. And I didn't give myself that. So I thought that I wasn't writing my book because I didn't have enough time. And then when I quit my job and all I had was time, because I was single, I had no children, I was living alone, and I had no job. So all I had to do was write the book. That's literally all I had to do. Yeah. And I found myself like swimming in too much time. And it was like, I'd get like stuck in my head. I'm staring at a blank page. I'm not making any progress. I'm getting really in my head about it. And so I think actually to make progress on a book, all you really need is about 5 hours a week. That's what I tell people. Like an hour a day, 5 days a week is plenty of time to make progress on a book. So you just got to set your alarm 1 hour earlier and get up and, right before you go to work. Or if you're like me and you have kids, then maybe a better way to do that is not in the mornings, but maybe to do it on a weekend day where you can tag team with your spouse, and your spouse takes the kids and you go write for 5 hours at a coffee shop. So however it works for you, if it's consolidating the time to one day or spreading it out. But you don't need to quit your job. You don't need to go rent a cabin in the woods. I mean, that's a nice luxury. It'd be wonderful.
Sounds cool. I kind of want the cabin in the woods. You're not the first person to say that, by the way. Another author I was recently talking to, his first book he wrote when he was a CEO and a dad. And he would write from like 4 a.m. till 7 or something. And he's like, I miss those days, because there's something about, I think he said the phrase, the freedom of constraints, that constraints somehow unlock something or created an urgency.
Yes.
And I hear you on not quitting your job as well. I have 3 young kids. I think that'd be a tough sell to my wife. Like, I'm just going to quit and start writing, and it'll be fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, as I looked at your book, there was one chapter in particular. We'll talk about others, but by the way, we don't usually talk about authors' books on this podcast. Okay. The goal is to be to talk about the craft of writing, but because your book is about the craft of writing, it's sort of a sweet loophole, and we can just chop it up about your book. So this chapter really grabbed my attention. Chapter 4, which is called How to Find the Hook, the Opening Line. And so I'm just going to read a short snippet, and then if you would just kind of unpack this for us, because I think this is really insightful. So you write, many people worry that their story isn't interesting enough to grip a reader's attention. Even if fascinating things have happened to them, They worry that the details must only be interesting to them. Why would anyone else care? Who would ever read this? What if the most interesting part about you and your story is something that you would never think to share? I've totally felt that as a writer. Why would anyone care about my story, sort of my suburban upbringing, right?
Yeah.
And as an editor, I've seen that as well in writers, sort of an insecurity or just like maybe a paralysis. They're not sure like if they should tell the story or not. So can you just share with us, how do you find the hook in your story so that we're telling it well? That is such an important skill.
Yeah, you're right that everybody who sits down to this process of writing has that insecurity that what I have to say is not that interesting. I've heard that from literally New York Times bestselling authors all the way to beginners at this process to say the same thing. What if what I have to say is not that interesting? And I think what people are really saying is, what if what I have to say isn't interesting to me? Like, what if I dig into this and I realize that what I have to share, I worry it's not that fascinating, or I worry it's not that interesting. So I think there's a few different angles that you can take to find the hook. Number one is, I find this is probably the most common, is the most interesting thing that you have to say is something that you're too afraid to say. So it's the thing you're holding back because you think, no one's going to accept me if I say this. No one wants to hear this part of my story. This is sort of too dark or upsetting. It's too embarrassing. It's going to make me feel embarrassed. So we're holding back those parts of our story. That part of your story is almost always the most interesting part. And most of us are holding back the most interesting parts of our stories. I think another thing that sometimes happens is, as it relates to telling personal stories, because I work with a lot of people who are writing memoirs, and when they get into the writing of their story, they realize that their story doesn't feel that interesting to them. And what I teach them to do is to notice how the elements that make a story interesting are the very elements they're avoiding in their day-to-day life. Things like problems. Problems are an essential ingredient to stories. And problems are what makes stories tick. It's what gives a story the tension that makes it interesting to us. Well, if in your day-to-day life, you're just like, no, thank you. I don't want any problems. I'd rather just,
which is a modern American goal, right?
100%.
Easy breezy ride for sure.
And it's not a very interesting story. Sure, it's a comfortable life, but it's not a very interesting story. So I teach people to pay attention to that, like to use their writing as a diagnostic tool to notice that if their writing is boring on the page, maybe it's because they're leaning away from conflict or tension or unanswered questions. Because another thing that makes a story interesting is an unanswered question. What's going to happen next, But if we're not interested in what's going to happen next, then the question is why? Why aren't we interested in what's happening next to the hero of the story? And then the third and final thing that I teach people to do as it relates to a hook is sometimes I feel like with most stories, the details don't have to be like, she was held captive for 24 hours by her schizophrenic boyfriend. That's an example I use in the book because I worked with an author who had that as a personal story. That does not have to be your story for it to be an interesting story to read. What makes a story interesting is the way that we organize the details. And so sometimes organizing the details differently, making the reader wait a lot longer to get to the resolution, can make a seemingly mundane story actually feel quite compelling, just arranging the details differently.
Could you break that down and just give us a quick example? Because that's fascinating.
Okay, so a basic story structure is built around a hero who wants something and has to overcome some kind of conflict in order to achieve it. So a lot of times what we do as writers is we want to give, especially with nonfiction, we want to give our reader the best of the best up front to keep them hooked. When actually it works the opposite. If you can sort of get your reader asking a question in the beginning, if you can open a story loop for them, if you can point to a problem that they have in their life that they don't yet have the solution to, you can pull their attention through the book, and you don't give them the best of the best until the end of the section, the end of the chapter, the end of the book, because you're getting them to ask a question, you're building the tension, and then you give them the nugget that closes the loop at the end. And it's counterintuitive as a writer because you want to give them like the most important thing in the beginning. But I have to teach people, especially in a book, because a book is 50,000 words, you know? So you got to keep your reader like wanting and hungry through most of the book and not give them the big answer that they're looking for until the very end. And people say, well, isn't that manipulative? And my answer to that is no. And here's why. Because of something called narrative transportation. When you can invite someone into a story and get them to follow along the story from start to finish, if you can captivate their attention until the very end, something happens in them called narrative transportation, which is where they experience physically and viscerally the same transformation that the hero in the story experiences. So if I read a story like Wild by Cheryl Strayed, I don't physically hike the Pacific Crest Trail, but I do in a way because I experienced narrative transportation. Yeah. So I'm with her on the trail. I'm with her when she loses her boot, you know? I'm with her when she's terrified of the men who confront her in the last few chapters of the book. So I experienced those feelings right along with her. And because of that, I vicariously get her transformation. And so when you can give that to a reader, you don't just deliver them information, but you actually take them on a journey that changes them. Yeah. And they get much more out of your book when you're willing to sort of like delay the gratification to the very end.
That's really, really true. I can think of certain books where the first third is amazing because the author is delivering all the goods, and then the latter 2/3 are okay. You know, I can think of so many books like that. So that's a really good practice. Let's just pause for a second and talk to the heart of the writers listening when it comes to telling your story, because, you know, maybe there's something stirring inside of them that they want to share, but self-doubt and fear and busyness sort of prevent them from moving forward. What would you say to those writers who are afraid of sharing their story or afraid that no one will listen?
Yeah. Well, I would just say you're not alone. That even the people who you point to and think they've achieved the pinnacle of success as it relates to writing, you know, they've been on the New York Times list or whatever. I've worked with clients all across the board. And I'm telling you, every single person I've ever worked with has that same feeling of what if what I have to say isn't interesting? You know, what if I do all this work and nobody reads it? What if my story doesn't matter as much as I hope it does? What if it's all meaningless, you know? And so I hope that people can find some solidarity in that, knowing that it's a very human, normal thing to feel, to wonder if the words that you put on the page are going to matter for anything. And also I would say we live in a period of time in history that's really unique because for thousands of years, only, you know, we have this idea that to be a writer is this really elite thing and only certain people are allowed into the club, and there's like this huge golden gate and most people are kind of shut out of the gate. I think one of the reasons that we have that, it's built into our DNA. It's passed down through epigenetics. One of the reasons I think is because for thousands of years, only certain people were allowed to learn to read and write, and only certain people were allowed to record their words and have their words go down in history. Right. So we live in this really unique time in history now where that's not true. Where any person who holds a smartphone in their hands can publish any words they choose to publish at any time they want with no permission, no gatekeepers, no waiting. No, I mean, like you could like fire off, you know, something on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, like whenever you want with no...
And people do.
Yeah, and people do. And so don't be your own gatekeeper, you know? There are plenty of gatekeepers that we still have to go through if you want to traditionally publish a book or whatever. But don't be the person who's shutting yourself down. Those people have existed for thousands of years to tell you, oh, well, you're not in the class that gets to record your words, you know? Yep. And so that sort of like lives inside of our bodies. But just notice the ways in which you do that, in which you shut down your own voice and tell yourself, you know, my story's not that interesting. I don't have anything that important to say. I'll just sit on the sidelines. I'll let someone else say it. Notice the ways in which you do that, and don't be the one who's keeping yourself from sharing what you have to say.
It's really, really good. It reminds me of John Acuff's book Soundtracks, which is basically about the negative loops that we replay, you know, over and over. Ally, I've never heard anyone articulate what you just said, exactly how you did it, but that's actually why we're called the Writer Circle. I've been using the language of publishing and writing feel sometimes like an elite inner circle that the cool kids get in, and a lot of people want in, but it's like, oh, you can't talk to an editor. You have to pay tons of money for a writing coach, you know, and you want so desperately just to learn and grow. And of course, some people try to milk the system and you need boundaries, but that's why this podcast exists. So you articulated, I like the verbiage of the Golden Gate. That's another helpful one. But the idea is that, we want to give our best away, and we want to equip people and help them understand how publishing works. And I think in this conversation, it's more about how to write well and how to overcome obstacles in our own, like internal and external obstacles. So it's really great. I wanted to circle back real quickly to something you said about tension, because in chapter 6, I remember you wrote that problems are an essential ingredient to stories. Yeah. And we all, I think, know that kind of like, okay, you need conflict, you need some kind of tension. However, in practice, we forget and we just jump right into here's what you should know, or here's the quick resolution. And we think we've built tension, but we've done it in miniature form when what's actually needed is like, we need to build it out, like you said. Yes. And that was it. So what was your phrase? Narrative transportation? Transportation,
yes.
Okay.
It's not my phrase. My friend JJ did his doctorate and all on the topic of narrative transportation. So I'm taking that from him. But it is, the act of the way that we step inside of stories as we hear them.
Gotcha. Okay. So can you just drop some wisdom for us on how you create tension well and what that actually looks like in writing and some ways to get at that?
Yeah. Okay. So what I teach people to do is to define the one big problem inside of the story that they're telling. So if you're writing a nonfiction book, I divide nonfiction books into two categories. One category is a story-driven book. So that would be like a memoir. A memoir, or maybe even a collection of essays. And then the other category would be content-driven. So that would be like a teaching or a how-to book. And there's some gray area, but I think in almost all cases you can put a book on one side or the other. So if you're writing a story-driven book, for example, you define the one big problem as the one obstacle that the hero of the story is up against. So Cheryl Strayed's Wild, her one big problem is the Pacific Crest Trail. You could say it's, the grief over losing her mother or something like that, but the reason that I would say her one big problem is the Pacific Crest Trail is because it's a very physical, tangible thing she's going to spend the entire book trying to climb over the top of, literally. Yep. And so that's her one big problem. In a nonfiction book, let's say it's a book on how to budget better or something. The one big problem is probably, the one big problem in a nonfiction book is going to be what the reader is experiencing in their life that's going to cause them to pick up this book. So their one big problem is probably, I've got no savings, I'm broke, and I'm living paycheck to paycheck or whatever it is. So when you define that one big problem, and you really have to go after that problem, especially in the first chapter of the story, and in the entire packaging of the book has to be like the cover, the title, the subtitle, the first chapter, the back cover copy, everything has to be pointed at that problem, because it's all about building the tension, asking the question, opening the loop, so that you can convince the reader to go get out their credit card. There are a lot of obstacles that the reader has to go over to even read the things that you have to say to them. So you've got to convince them to pull out their credit card, to, pick up the book off the shelf, to walk up to the front counter, to hand over their hard-earned $25, and to walk up. And then you have to convince them to crack open the book and actually read it, because how many books do you buy that sit on your nightstand that you never actually read? And the ones that we read are the ones that speak so specifically to our problem that we just can't even help it. It's like almost like an instinct. And I steal this example from Donald Miller, who I've done a lot of work with. He was really instrumental to helping with this book. But he talks about, with StoryBrand, talks about like the analogy of aspirin or Advil. Like the only time you go buy Advil is when you have a headache. So you have to decide, if your book is Advil, what's the headache? You know, when you've got a headache, you're going to go, it doesn't matter. Like, you go to the airport, whatever, and it's $12 for 2 Advil. And you're just like, fine, whatever I need to do to get rid of the headache. You know, you're going to go spend whatever it takes to get the Advil. And you have to figure out, if my book is the Advil, what's the headache that I'm solving for people?
Wow.
And with story-driven books, I think that can be a little more challenging, because you know, stories don't necessarily like resolve one problem, but I do think it's important to think about, what is the one problem that I'm solving for a reader, and how can I make sure that that problem really connects with them, so that they'll buy the book and open it and read it.
Yeah. So what's the Advil is the takeaway question there. I like that. Let's lean into the first type of nonfiction book, which would be story-driven, because in my experience, a lot of aspiring writers, that's where they're honestly starting. They don't have a how-to book with a crisp outline. They're like, no, something happened to me, or I've learned something, or I want to share an experience.
Yes.
And it can be really cathartic in a good way, right? To write your own experiences. But the minute you are saying, I want others to read this, is the minute you need to be offering them something also of value. And of course, we know everyone's story matters in and of itself. Everyone is valuable, and merely telling their story is worthwhile. But a lot of writers aspire, of course, to sell their books. And so you kind of did just talk about this, but how do you avoid telling your story without just going on and on? Like, there are dangers of storytelling, right? And the danger is that you have a mind-numbing amount of detail. You leave readers wondering, what was the point of that?
Sure.
And so how do you kind of avoid that?
Well, in my opinion, there's no such thing as too much detail. There's detail told in such a way that it doesn't have an end point, there's not a reason for sharing it. And when you're doing that, so there's a difference. It's like, I don't know if you've read any Pat Conroy, but Pat Conroy is a brilliant writer who rambles on for pages and pages and pages about the landscape. You know what I mean? But the landscape of South Carolina, which is what he's talking about, is all a metaphor. It's all aligned with the controlling idea of what his book is about. The tragedy of being, you know, alive and part of this family, this really like messed up, toxic family situation from the South. So you're reading, you're like, why am I so gripped and fascinated by this man talking about the landscape of South Carolina for pages and pages and pages? And the reason is because it's all in alignment with his controlling idea. So I think the same is true for storytelling. And what I tell people to do, especially with their first draft, is to write it all. Because the main reason is because an editor can't edit something that's not there. So how would I know if I can't pull something out of thin air? I can always delete 6 paragraphs and say that's not important to the story. But I can't move something around. I can't edit it if it's not on the page. So I tell people to just tell it exactly the way that you would tell it if you were sitting across from a friend at the table. Just tell every last detail. If you think it's interesting, it's interesting. It belongs on the page. Now, we might delete it later before we share it with a reader, but put it on the page for now. Yeah. So that's where I tell people to begin. And then it's really about defining the important pieces that you have to define. What is this story really about? Why am I telling the reader this story? And when you can define that, when you answer that question for yourself, it gives you clarity about what belongs in the story and what gets weeded out. And sometimes that clarity can be challenging because, you know, like the kill your darlings Faulkner quote. Yeah. Sometimes parts of the writing that you're very married to they're not aligned with the controlling idea, so they have to go. Even if they're beautiful, like they might be beautifully written, but they're not aligned with the controlling idea, and so the reader's going to lose interest and lose trust in you as the author, and so they have to go. But you don't even have a way to know that until you know what the controlling idea is.
Yeah. Now, do details have to be utilitarian? Do they have to serve the controlling idea, or can they just be beautiful?
They have to serve the controlling idea. Doesn't matter how beautiful they are. Okay. They have to serve the controlling idea.
I can feel the darlings dying as we speak.
Yeah. There's no way to get around that. I mean, it's just,
That's That's really good. I heard a helpful analogy. They were talking about public speaking, but it's true of writing as well, where they were saying the question is not how much can you keep, it's how much can you eliminate. And they used the image of the famous statue of David being chiseled out of a block of marble. And it's like, you know, you have a masterpiece when you have removed as much as possible. And that was a helpful paradigm shift for me. But as you're talking, I'm going to put myself on the chopping block here. And it'll be hard because you won't know the full context. But I was editing this manuscript, and the author was describing this conversation in this exotic location he was having with other leaders. And they were talking about a really difficult situation that had kind of happened in the organization. So that was the topic. Like, what are we going to do about the situation? And as he described the scene, he kept mentioning being at this cafe and sitting, and that the chairs around the table were mismatched. He seemed just obsessed with this detail. So it was like 3 or 4 times he mentions the mismatched chairs. Now, I took that out of the book. Was I wrong?
It depends on, well, so I don't think you were wrong. I think if as the reader and as the editor, if it seems like too much attention is being paid to this detail, then you probably as an editor were right to remove it. My question would be, from the perspective of the author of Write Your Story, why is that detail so important to him? What does it represent to him? Because it probably meant something to him that he didn't know how to communicate or say, you know, in the manuscript. And maybe it belongs in the manuscript, maybe it doesn't, but I would be really curious to know, like, why did that stand out to him so much?
Yeah, well, because I'm a personal friend of this author, I think it was because, and why I took it out was he's a total sucker for aesthetics and vintage chairs. So he's always noticing, you know, the lighting in a room or just those little things. But anyways, I just thought it'd be fun to bring up an example. I know you'd have to obviously see the full story to make a call. But I can think of other examples. But that's really helpful to just to frame it as know what the controlling idea is. If you cannot clearly articulate it probably in a single sentence, then maybe try to do that hard work before, you know, you tell your story.
Another example that seems relevant to share, I read this article in, I think, USA Today by the ghostwriter who wrote the book for Prince Harry. Did you read this article?
Wow. I don't think so.
So the ghostwriter who wrote Prince Harry's book also wrote Andre Agassi's book, and is a really, he wrote Phil Knight's book, and he also written a memoir of his own. He's a really brilliant man and such a good writer. Well, he wrote this article in, I think it was USA Today, talking about how he got into this long-standing argument with Prince Harry over a detail that he kept cutting out of the manuscript, and Harry kept putting it back in.
Arguing with the prince.
Yeah, exactly. I know. And you'd think, you can picture the argument. You're just like, well, it's your book, I guess, if you want to have it in there. But what the ghostwriter knows that most average readers don't know or don't think about, and that Prince Harry probably also doesn't know, is that a stray detail that deviates from the controlling idea, one stray detail in a 400-page book, can ruin the entire thing. So because he knows that, he's doing his job by saying, I don't care what you think, I don't care what you say, I don't care if it's your book or not, this detail is not going in the book. It's distracting. It's going to distract the reader from the path that you want to take them on. Wow.
Yeah, that's either editorial courage right there to stand up to Prince Harry, or it's author humility, or maybe both. Yeah. Well, you said the best books feel like a journey, which I think is so true. And so in the hands of a capable author, you know, readers have a sense they're headed somewhere meaningful, that nothing's an accident. And a big part of that is, I think, creating a solid outline, and not to be rigid in our storytelling, but to be purposeful. You know, it's tempting just to sit down, start writing, see where you end up. And I know some writers actually may thrive in that approach, and that's fine. But let's talk about outlines for a second. Because you're a writing coach, how do you craft a solid outline so that we can write with clarity and beauty? Like, what are some of the ways you workshop this with writers? I would love to hear.
So an outline is built around the transformation of the hero of the story. So in a story-driven book, that's the main character of the story that you're writing about, which in a memoir would be you. In a content-driven book, that hero of the story is your reader. So you're taking your reader on a journey. You want them to change from the beginning of a story to the end. Maybe you want them to go from, being bad with money to being really savvy with their money. And so you're going to take them on a journey of transformation where they start with being haphazard with their money and they end being really savvy with their money. So the outline is built around that transformation. And then there are a set of steps that have to take place in the process in order for them to experience that transformation. There are a few things that we know have to happen. They have to overcome some problem. So they have at least one problem, probably a handful of problems in their path that need to be overcome. They'll meet some kind of guide who helps them along the way. If you're writing a content-driven book, you as the author you are the guide in their story. You're one of maybe a handful of guides. They need to have some kind of paradigm shift. Each chapter is built around a paradigm shift, something that changes about the way the reader thinks, feels, or acts. Every chapter is shaped around that change. So in a way, every little chapter is a tiny arc that fits underneath the entire arc of the book. So the way I show it is it's like, you see a narrative arc that arcs up like this, and each chapter is almost like a loop that loops underneath the arc. So that's where we start. I always start with who's your one perfect reader, because I teach people to write books to one person. And I teach them to write the book to a person who they know in real life, whose name they know and whose face they recognize, not to like demographics or a mashup of any kind, but to one person. And then we define, who that person is, what the problem is that they're up against, and then what kind of transformation do we want to see them have. And the entire book is built around the transformation of that reader.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Do you find that story arc is intuitive to a lot of writers you work with, or is it something you have to keep reminding them, like, hey, this chapter needs to contribute to the arc. You've gone off course.
It is and it isn't intuitive. There are parts of it that are intuitive to us for sure. And when you said a minute ago that some people just like to write and see where they end up, it's my opinion that those people who write and see where they end up, if that works for you, you probably so deeply and intuitively understand narrative arcs that you don't need to sit down and write an outline. The problem with a book, as opposed to any other format of writing, like writing a 5-paragraph essay or writing a persuasive essay or whatever, the problem with the book is it's so long, it's so much content, no human brain could possibly hold all that content inside of it at the same time. And so because of that, even if you intuitively can create a narrative arc in like an Instagram post or like, even like 1,000 words, when it comes to writing 55,000 words, you can't hold it all in your head at the same time. So how do you create a narrative arc? The only way to do it is to break it down into smaller pieces and to really be intentional with an outline. And so yeah, I think you have to do that. Otherwise, I tell the story and I tell this in Write Your Story. But when I first quit my job to write my first manuscript, I was like, oh yeah, this will take me 6 months, no problem. I've been writing all my life. I'm a really strong writer. I'm sure I can tackle this. And it was a lot of just like wandering around, staring at the blank page, not knowing what to do because I didn't have an outline that I was operating from. And in my mind, I was like, I'm going to get struck by inspiration and it's just going to flow through me and it's just going to come out and I'm going to know what the book is about. But inspiration doesn't work that way, And I think when we're resistant to creating an outline, it's usually because we don't really know what we're trying to say. And so that would be my question is like, let's think about that first. Like, what is it that you're trying to say? And when we can nail that down, then the writing part will actually come very easily. But if you try to write without knowing what you're going to say, then, you're setting yourself up for a lot of spinning and confusion.
Yeah. Lots of wasted time and heartache too. Like you can spare yourself that, it does feel arduous, even as a writer, I get it, but man, it saves immense effort. And then, as you're writing, you're kind of fueled by this end destination that you're getting to and where you're at in the journey, and that's just satisfying. So well, let's turn a corner from how to write, which is I think kind of what we've been talking about, to when to write, because a lot of writers express that they don't really have time. And I'm thinking of especially moms with several kids, which would be my
Sure.
own wife, and but also the person with, you know, the demanding job, maybe the person even with health concerns and setbacks, you know, so not just excuse makers, but no, legitimately people who have a lot on their plate that we would empathize with, but who we would also say as editors and writers and coaches, you can still do it. We really believe you can do it. Like, you can do this. So what are some, you know, everyone loves life hacks, right? So what are kind of some principles or hacks that you would say allow writers to work on their craft consistently and avoid distraction and hit deadlines?
Okay, I have some really practical tips, but I want
Love
to
it.
preface it by saying the reason why these work so well, because they're not hard and fast. You don't have to do it this way for it to work. But the reason why these tips work really well is because of what's happening in your brain, or what needs to happen in your brain in order for you to lock into that creative flow. What needs to happen in your brain is for you to drop out of your frontal cortex and into your limbic brain. Your limbic brain is a much more primal, intuitive part of your brain, and it's the part of your brain where all of your imaginative play is going to come from. It's where all of your creativity is going to come from. Your frontal cortex is very necessary for modern life. It's the higher functioning part of your brain, but it's going to short circuit your creativity. Your frontal cortex is going to be like, are we almost out of time? We've got to leave for school. I've got to get the kids to, you know, to drop off. Like, your frontal cortex is going to be like, I forgot I have a bill I have to pay. It's due by the 17th, you know, quick, I got to get onto my bank account and transfer some money over and get the bill out. So your frontal cortex is a necessary part of your brain, but it will short circuit your creativity. And knowing that we have to find a way to sort of turn off the frontal cortex and activate the limbic part of our brain, which we don't do a lot in modern society, honestly. Yeah. Knowing that informs why the tips that I'm about to give work really well. The number one tip that I give is to write first thing in the morning. Now, this is tough for moms. I have two little kids at home. I have a 2.5-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. And I can't tell you the last time that I wrote first thing in the morning. I just don't have access to it right now in my life. It's just not available to me, which is fine. That doesn't mean, again, like, it's important to say, this doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means you have to find another way to short circuit that frontal cortex and drop into your limbic system. The reason why writing first thing in the morning works really well for that is because when you're asleep and when you're dreaming, you're already in your limbic system. And your frontal cortex takes a minute to wake up in the morning. So if you can sort of catch it off guard, and first things first, you get your coffee and you sit down to your computer and get some writing done, you can catch the most effective creative part of your brain before your frontal cortex even kicks in for the day. So like in my life right now, I'm woken up by my kids in the morning. But if I set an alarm for 4 a.m., if I was really motivated and wanted to get up before my kids, I could set my alarm for 4:30, something like that, and I could get up before the kids. That's not what I'm doing right now, but it's, you know, if it's available to you, first thing in the morning is a great time to write. Some authors that I've worked with, some writers, say that they get a similar kind of wave of inspiration late at night. I'm not a night person, so this also doesn't really work for me. But if you are a night person and you get that like 10 p.m., kids are in bed, everyone else is kind of powering off for the day, and like, ooh, I'm feeling creative. That is another time of day where your frontal cortex feels safe to check out, because there's no meetings at 10 p.m. There's no drop off at 10 p.m. There's no, you know, nothing on the schedule at 10 p.m. And so your brain feels free to be like, ooh, I could let go and do something creative at this time of day. And so if that works for you, that's another thing that you could try. Another great way to activate the frontal cortex if morning writing isn't available to you, and this is what I do, is to get your heart rate up. When you get your heart rate up, you disengage your frontal cortex and activate your limbic system. To do some sort of rote activity, something that takes no conscious thought for you. So showering, brushing your teeth, folding laundry, vacuuming, cleaning the house. I mean, this is a great one for moms, right? Like, if you can get someone to take your children out of the house, and you can take 30 to 45 minutes to just sort of clean up your surroundings and feel like you're on your feet again, that will oftentimes kickstart that limbic brain again, and then you could sit down and get 20 minutes of writing done before your kids come back home, or maybe even longer if you've got, you know, your husband's out with the kids for a couple hours or whatever. So road activities, getting your heart rate up, writing in the morning, writing at night. And then the other piece to recognize is just that your brain is a muscle. And so it's affected just like every other part of your body is affected. That if you drink, a half a glass of wine the night before you want to write, or you have too much sugar, or you eat a food that, doesn't agree with your body or something like that, you're just not going to get the best out of your creative brain, the same way that you wouldn't get the best out of your body if you went to the gym after drinking half a glass of, or half a bottle of wine. So, just knowing that about my body, like I don't drink anymore. It's a big part of that is, just the effects on my total body that I found like at 40 years old, my body doesn't recover nearly as well as it used to. And so drinking a glass of wine isn't worth it to me in the same way that it used to be. But I also have to think about sugar, because sugar is another vice. If I eat a bunch of sugar the night before,
I'm with you.
I'm trying to write, then I'm kind of like in a fog the next day. So thinking about those things and just being conscious of like drinking plenty of water, getting outside, getting some sunshine, getting some exercise, taking good care of the body is taking good care of the brain.
Yeah, that is really, really helpful. So the moral of the story is treat your body right and ambush your brain. Those are the goals.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I'm a few years coming up on 40, so I definitely feel you on all of what you shared as well.
Yeah.
Well, Ally, it's been a pleasure to talk with you. And maybe one last question would just be, because you're a champion of so many writers, and we're grateful for that, and you're also putting your own fantastic content into the world, which Write Your Story comes out, is it February? What date is it? I don't want to mess up the
May
date.
7th.
May 7th.
Yeah.
I don't know why I was saying February. We're past that right now. I'm coming up on 40. I already said it. So
you've got 3 kids. That's your excuse.
Yes, and they're all under 5. So that's my disclaimer.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah.
But could you just speak, if you would, a word of encouragement to listeners, to writers who are dreaming about a project or in the throes of one now, who needed to be reminded that their story and their craft matter? What would you say to them?
I would say this story is calling to you for a reason. And that reason may be because you need to put it on paper, and it's going to be published, and it's going to be read by hundreds of thousands of people, and it's going to be a New York Times bestseller, and it's going to be made into a major motion picture. And it may not be that at all. It may be that you put this story down and it changes the way that you see yourself, and it changes the way that you feel about yourself, and it changes the way that you interact with everybody in your life, and it changes the trajectory of your life forever, and nobody ever reads it except for you. And either way, you will never, ever regret taking this ride to tell your story. So don't see if you can enter into the process without needing to know what the outcome is going to be. You don't need to know if it's going to be a New York Times bestseller or if it's going to never be read by a single soul. Your story still matters and still needs to be recorded, and it's calling to you for a reason. So don't ignore it.
What a great word. Well, Ally, pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for just fire hosing us with writing wisdom and practices, and you even dipped into neuroscience. So, wow, that was incredible. Thank you so much for your time. And again, please follow Ally I follow her on Instagram, and she posts lots of great little bits of content. You do a lot of prompts, if you're trying to figure out how to get into a story. You posted on that recently, but where else can we find you and follow you?
I mean, the best thing to do would be to go buy the book or follow me on Instagram. Those are the two best ways to glean from the wisdom at this point. Awesome.
Okay. So go pre-order Write Your Story, and you will learn a ton. Thank you again, Ally. So appreciate your time.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for having me.